Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Sarah Small and I'm Food Tank's Chief of Staff. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Anna Lappe. She's joining us again and she is the author, educator, activist, project director of Food MythBusters and Real Food Media Project. And she's also the co-founder of Small Planet Institute and the Small Planet Fund. Today her presentation will discuss the ABCs of the GMO debate. Do we really need GMOs to feed the world? This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com later today. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using hashtag #FoodTank. And please do submit your questions. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So you can submit your questions throughout the course of the webinar to Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at foodtank.com. Send them in your chat box or post them on Twitter again with hashtag #FoodTank. So without further ado, Anna, it's truly an honor to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I'll give you the floor now.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to join you all again, and thanks to all of you joining us from all around the world. And as Sarah said, I will be presenting, and then as we have in the past, I will leave time to hear your questions and engage with you with those questions toward the end of the hour. And I wanted to just begin by defining our terms. I think GMOs is a term that we increasingly hear a lot. We certainly know that there are genetically engineered ingredients in much of the processed foods in our supermarkets, but I think a lot of people are still not so clear on what we're referring to. So I want to start with a definition, and then the second thing I want to start with is a little bit of background about me before jumping into the ABCs of GMOs. So definitionally, the definition I like to use is that from the World Health Organization that says very simply that genetically modified organisms, that's GMOs, can be defined as organisms, and that can be plants, animals, or microorganisms in which the genetic material, so the DNA, has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating or by natural recombination. So it's a really general term. And typically when we engage in a debate around GMOs, certainly in this country, when we hear about GMOs, we're talking about a specific type of GMO, and that is the genetically modified organisms that we currently have in the marketplace today. And you'll hear me talk later about what those products are. And so keep in mind when you hear some of the debates about GMOs, some of the things that I'll bring up today, that we're talking about those that have been commercialized to date. You'll hear me refer to some of the promises from the industry that's producing these GMOs about the potential benefits that we might reap in the future. But what I really think is important is to look at what has been commercialized to date, what has been that impact, and what does that tell us about the role that GMOs play or don't play in feeding the future. So a little bit of background about me. I think it's always helpful to have a sense of who you're talking to and where their knowledge comes from. I have been researching and writing around food and sustainability issues for about 15 years now, starting with my first book, Hope's Edge, that I wrote with my mother, Frances Moore Lappé. A lot of my understanding about GMOs comes from the research that I've done in the field, talking to farmers, talking to scientists, talking to academics. The picture that you see here on this first slide is actually an image that a friend of mine took from a gathering that I attended a number of years ago in the Western African country of Mali with about 600 farmer activists from every single region in the world, representing farmers that were embracing organic farming and agroecology and ecological practices on their farms. And so a lot of my understanding of the impacts of GMOs and the potential of GMOs and really the ABCs of GMOs comes from this research that I've done on the ground. As I mentioned, I've written a couple of books. The most recent one I did is about the intersections between food systems and climate change, which if you want me to dive into more of those questions during the Q&A period, I would be happy to. So that kind of gives you a sense of how my understanding of GMOs has been informed. And so I want to dive in now to what are some of the big claims that we hear about GMOs, and then I'll spend the rest of the time kind of looking at each of them in turn. So you'll see here there's 6, and these I've identified as kind of the 6 big arguments for GMOs from proponents. And you listening might be nodding your head that yes, you have heard these arguments. You might think of others, but I'm going to take them in turn. And so this first one is that we need GMOs to feed the world. The second and related one is that this technology, as it's been applied, has really helped to increase yields. The third argument is that GMOs are really good for farmers. The fourth is that they are good for the planet. And again, you'll hear me talk about each of these. The fifth is that, and a related one to number 4, that they reduce chemical use. And the sixth, and I think this is one that is really important to address, is that, okay, you know, you may not be a huge fan of this technology, but there is no alternative. And certainly from my vantage point and from my experience traveling internationally, this to me is I think one of the biggest myths that I hear about GMOs. So a little bit before diving into this first one, that we need GMOs to feed the world, just a little bit of kind of situating you in kind of the status of GMOs today, and kind of what are the biggest companies in the marketplace. Certainly one of the biggest companies producing GMOs is the company Monsanto, which is a chemical company, and you'll hear me talk a bit about Monsanto and about the relationship between agricultural chemicals and GMOs. And just to give you a sense of the size, Monsanto in the last 3 years has had about $15 billion in sales from its 2 main divisions, which are these biotech seeds and agricultural chemicals. Keep in mind, the very first genetically engineered food product was introduced in 1994, and by 1999, we had GMOs planted on more than 100 million acres here in this country. And you'll hear me talk a little bit more about what those products are and where GMOs are being planted. And so I raise all of this to say that there's a couple big companies that are really the biggest players in the marketplace. And we have really good evidence now, after having commercialized GMOs for quite some time, to look at what the impacts are. So this first argument that we need GMOs to feed the world. The first way to respond to this argument, I think, and I would argue is one of the most important ways, is really to go to the underlying question, which is, what is the root cause of hunger? It's something that my mother, Frances Moore Lappé, has been writing about and talking about for 40 years. And what she and many of her colleagues have argued for all of these decades is that the root cause of hunger is not a production problem. In other words, the GMO advocates say that we need GMOs to feed the world because we need to produce more food. And what my mother and colleagues at institutes like the Institute for Food and Development Policy and many other experts around the world around hunger have pointed out is that for all of these many decades, since the hunger crisis of the 1970s, the crisis of famine in the 1970s, that we actually have, during all these moments of hunger, and still today we have about 1 billion people going hungry in the world, that even within this context of rampant hunger, there is more than enough food to feed the world. That this fundamental argument is that hunger is not caused by a scarcity of food, but as my mother and others have said, but by a scarcity of democracy, by a scarcity of who has power over what is getting grown and who has access to it. You'll see here, this is a statistic from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, that just looking at food waste alone, just looking at the 1.3 billion tons of food wasted alone, that would be enough to feed all of the hungry people in the world. And that when you look at the amount of calories that we as a globe produce, it is more than enough calories to make every single one of us well fed. So to start responding to this, we need GMOs to feed the world. I always think it's really important to remind people that we don't need to produce more. And in fact, if we don't change anything about the sort of democratic control over our food system, and we continue on the path that we are, and we produce more, there is no guarantee that that is going to actually address the root cause of hunger, because there is this disconnect from why people are hungry and the production of food. I mean, you look at the United States, I don't think anyone would argue we're not producing enough food here, and yet 47 million Americans rely on food stamps, and many people going going hungry in this country, it's perhaps the most clear example of it. There's not a relationship between kind of productivity and levels of hunger. The other thing that other argument I like to make when we take on this question of do we need GMOs to feed the world is to look at, well, what is the GMO technology in the marketplace today? And remember, at the top of the webinar, I said what's really important, what I'm talking about today, is what's been commercialized. And this is a slide from the USDA. It's their most recent data looking at the percent of planted acres of GMOs in this country. And the HT is herbicide tolerant, if you're wondering what that is. And the BT, you'll hear me talk about what BT cotton and BT corn is. But you can look at what's been commercialized, and these are the main crops that have been commercialized in the US. These are not crops that we eat directly. These are not crops that are fundamental to health and nutrition. And if you look at these commodities that are GMOs, the lion's share of these commodities are actually going to things like livestock feed, or in the case of corn, going into corn-based ethanol. So when we're looking at, what is it going to take to feed the world? It's going to take growing food that is nutritious and healthy and abundant. And the commercialized GMOs in the marketplace today are certainly not meeting that need. And the other thing I like to point out when we look at what this connection between hunger and GMOs is to look at where they're being planted. So the previous slide I showed you was the US and the types of GMOs that are being grown, and those are pretty much those ones that are being grown internationally. And if you look at GMO adoption by region, you see that most of these GMOs are actually concentrated in just a few countries, with really the United States being the largest producer of GMOs. Perhaps the most strong argument around how the GMOs are really not addressing hunger is if you look at what GMOs have been commercialized. Again, the origins of GMOs really came out of companies like Monsanto, which are agricultural chemical companies, and the technology has really focused on just a handful of engineered traits. So again, remember, the definition of GMOs is quite broad, but how is it being applied and what type of GMOs exist in the marketplace? They're really focused on just a couple of traits. So they've either been seeds that have been modified to be herbicide resistant, resistant to a proprietary herbicide. In the case of Monsanto, it's Roundup Ready, or to express an insecticide, like those engineered from a gene from a soil bacterium known by the shorthand BT, which causes seeds to produce a protein toxic to certain insects. Some GMOs are stacked with multiple traits. In other words, they can be herbicide resistant and they can be BT. And again, most of those that are herbicide resistant are resistant to a proprietary herbicide, Roundup, which is glyphosate, an herbicide that was recently deemed a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization. So in other words, nearly all the GMOs that we have in the marketplace today are either replicating or resisting a pesticide. And there are currently very few plants commercially available that are engineered for any other trait. You might have heard recently about the Arctic apple. So this is a genetically engineered apple that won't brown. But that was one of the only other products in the marketplace that has been genetically engineered for any other trait. So I'm just going to go back to this previous slide again. So again, you can see these are the technologies. There's HT, or herbicide tolerant soybeans, or the BT corn, BT cotton, HT corn. These are the lion's share of what is being grown, and I would argue they are not helping us address those root causes of hunger. So let's jump to the second argument, which is a real corollary to the first, which is that we need GMOs to feed the world. And that is that this technology helps to make crops more productive. And when we talk about this, really when the argument's made, the definition of productivity is very, very narrow. It's just looking at yield per acre, and the argument is that a genetically modified corn has better yield per acre than a non-genetically modified corn, for instance. I would argue that in my definition of productivity is much broader than that, and includes a requirement that you look at all the inputs that go in to create such productivity, and also all of the negative outputs that come out, whether it's pollution or other negative outcomes. But let's just stay for a second with this very narrow definition of yield per acre. And what you see is that with the argument you hear from companies like Monsanto is that the yields for corn planted in the US from 1996 to 2008 rose by 28%. And GMO corn seeds were first widely planted in the late 1990s. And you hear that argument, and I've certainly heard it made by industry proponents, and you think, wow, 28% yield growth? That's incredible. But what's important to note is that this argument that there's been this incredible growth in yields from corn planted in the US confuses correlation with causation. And here's what I mean. Yields did shoot up during those years for corn, but those increases had very little to do with genetic engineering and the genetic engineering technology that a company like Monsanto introduced. That instead, researchers have shown that really that yield increase came from advances in conventional breeding and other improvements in farming methods, and that one estimate put that the yield increase that you could actually attribute just to genetic engineering is just a couple percentage points, but actually not this incredible yield growth that you saw during that period. And the other thing that you're seeing, and this is the slide I wanted to show next, is that we're seeing that actually there's studies coming out from the world of academics that study agroecology, which is a way of producing food that doesn't rely on chemicals, doesn't rely on genetic engineering, that really focuses on the ecology of a farm for soil fertility, that really focuses on biodiversity, that focuses on a range of techniques to help farmers grow food well. And what these studies are showing is that there's incredible yield benefits from agroecology, and then actually in some comparative studies between GMO technology and agroecology, some of those studies are showing that agroecology is really showing a huge benefit. The other thing that we are seeing, and this study that I cite here, which any of you could find online by Heinemann and colleagues in the International Journal of Agricultural Sustainability, was a study that compared yields for some major commodity crops like corn and soy in the European Union and the United States over the past 15 years. And the reason why this comparison was done was to look at, well, in the EU, there has not been the genetic modification of those core commodity crops, while in the US, almost all of the corn and soy today are genetically modified. And let's compare those for yield growth. And what this Heinemann study found is that there really is an insignificant amount of difference in yields in those two regions. And again, kind of furthering the argument that you're not seeing this incredible bump in yield out of this technology. And this is another example, again, from a great study I'd recommend people taking a look at, that looked at all of the expansion of efforts to create more research around different increasing biodiversity of crops like corn, and that in using studies of some of these varietals of corn that have found that they've done very, very well. And one of the things that is really key to note is that you're finding increasingly in studies coming out of the agroecology community and those doing comparisons between chemical agriculture and non-chemical agriculture, is that there's really clear results showing that during extreme weather events, droughts and flooding, that the ecological systems are holding up much better. And I write about this in my book, Diet for a Hot Planet. I think this is a really important point when we're talking about this question of productivity, not just today or historically, but going into the future. In other words, all the yield data that we have is historic, and all the studies most of the studies that I'm seeing are looking at historic yield results, comparing, say, GMOs and non-GMOs. But we know, thanks to the climate change that is locked in, that there is going to be more extreme fluctuations in weather, more extreme weather events like flooding and droughts. And so we're seeing very clear results that these ecological systems function better during those extreme weather events. So a lot of experts are saying this is predictive that if we're talking about how to have a sustainable food system into the future, that now is the time to be investing in the systems that function best during these extreme weather events. So the third argument that we hear a lot is that GMOs are better for farmers, and that's why farmers are turning to GMOs. And like all the arguments, I think this is a compelling one. I think it's important to explore it. And what I have heard talking to farmers is that actually that there's incredible farmer risk involved with GMO technology, and I'll talk about why. And one of the questions I get when I mention this is people say, "But Anna, farmers across this country are choosing GMOs. Farmers aren't dumb. Farmers are some of the smartest people we've got. If they're choosing GMOs, they're choosing for a reason." And if any of you on this call have spent time kind of in our central Midwest in this country talking with farmers, what you'd hear from at least the farmers that I've been talking with is that they don't feel like it's a choice for GMOs or not GMOs, that in a lot of places in the Midwest now, it is the only option. If you want to keep your farm, if you want to continue as a commodity grower, this is the only choice you've got. So in other words, it's not much of a choice at all. But how do GMOs increase farmer risk? I think one of the biggest ways in which I'm hearing from farmers that they're increasing risk has to do with what we've seen about their impact on the ecology of a farm. And one of them that this slide refers to is the fact that GMOs are proving themselves to be a real trap for conventional farmers in that they increase problems like super weeds on the farm. So glyphosate, if you'll remember, is an herbicide that is widely used in the Monsanto proprietary name for it is Roundup, used in herbicide-tolerant GMO production systems. And we're finding that there's a huge amount of herbicide-resistant super weeds that are really impacting farmers. Here in the slide, this is Iowa State University study that found that there's 60 million acres of U.S. farmland now has these glyphosate-resistant super weeds. And here from this slide, you can see this is USDA data looking at the growth of glyphosate and super weeds, and you can see the increase in glyphosate that's been applied since the early 1990s and the introduction of GMOs, and the increase in herbicide-resistant weeds. The other thing that we're seeing, again, this is kind of a predicted ecological outcome from introducing widespread insecticide, is you're also seeing the problem of pests becoming resistant to insecticides. A lot of folks talk about this insecticide resistance or weeds becoming resistant to an herbicide as a chemical treadmill. In other words, it kind of keeps farmers are kind of stuck on a treadmill where as weeds become more resistant, they need to use more herbicides or more toxic herbicides. As pests become resistant, same thing. It's this chemical treadmill that really becomes a trap for farmers. This quote here you see on this slide is from a Wall Street Journal article from 2015 about this growing pest resistance to GMO crops, and how it has a lot of farmers worried. And what we found is that with Midwestern farmers really turning to pest-resistant corn since the first varieties were launched in 1996, that it's really diminished the insecticide's power over certain bugs like the corn rootworm, which is really a huge concern for corn farmers. That what's been found, and this Wall Street Journal article talks about this, is repeated exposure to the corn's bug-killing proteins, as they put it, means that this small number of rootworms that are able to consume that Bt toxin and live can reproduce by the thousands and spread across fields that are used to grow corn year after year. So that's this classic chemical treadmill. It's being reported increasingly in mainstream media, places like the Wall Street Journal, and it's a huge concern for farmers. So the other argument that we hear is that GMOs are good for the environment. And again, we have an increasing kind of body of evidence about what is the impact of GMOs on our soils and our waters. And I'll give a couple examples here with you today, but I don't have time in any of these examples I'm giving you to go as deep as the evidence goes. But I hope that this gives you some sense of how to think about what's the impact of GMOs on soil and on water. So one of the things that we hear the industry claim is that engineered seeds reduce soil erosion, reduce water and chemical use. And if you look at the historical record, again, since GMOs were first introduced here in the United States, that what you see is that there was a decline in soil erosion on cropland in the US since the introduction of engineered seeds. And so industry advocates say, hey, look at that. There is a decline in soil erosion since the mid-1990s. That's proof that our technology is having this beneficial impact on soil. But kind of like my earlier example about confusing correlation and causation here, the improvements or I should say reduction in soil erosion during this period in this country was not because of the introduction of GMOs. The introduction of GMOs actually coincided historically with the introduction of some really strong federal policies that encourage farmers to use better conservation practices. And what researchers have seen, what the researchers argue, is that actually it was those conservation packages and practices that we can thank for the reduction in soil erosion, that it's not been the introduction of GMOs, that in fact, this GMO technology, especially the incentivization to use a huge amount of herbicides and other chemicals is actually very detrimental to soil health. And this, I loved this quote from this Iowa farmer that said, anything you put on the land affects the chemistry and biology of the land, and that's a powerful pesticide. It's quoted in Misgivings about how a weed killer affects the soil from Stephanie Strom, New York Times. This study from the Union of Concerned Scientists called High and Dry was from 2012. It looked at this question of, how do GMOs affect soil erosion and water retention? And so just to stay for a minute on this water efficiency question. So the argument from proponents of GMOs is that GMOs help reduce water use and help retain water on farms, which of course we all care about when we see what an important resource water is. But what we're finding actually, what this study talked about, what other studies have found, is that there's actually no evidence that there's this great benefit to GMOs in terms of water efficiency, that in fact, what we're seeing is that in studies looking at organic agricultural practices, that organic techniques really improve water efficiency on farms. That one of the bedrock principles of organic agriculture is to build healthy soil. And that in doing so, what researchers have found is that healthy organic soil on farms that are using those practices have lower soil temperatures, which in turn reduces water loss to evaporation. And that farms that aren't using synthetic fertilizers and the chemicals used in the GMO technologies, that those farms have been found to have higher rates of organic matter in their soils, which also allow them to retain more water. I've certainly seen with my own eyes visiting organic farms this in practice, and seen and heard from farmers about how their organic practices have really helped them with their water management. The other thing that we are hearing about is, before I jump to this next point, that we're seeing that increasingly evidence that glyphosate, the herbicide that I mentioned earlier, is really increasingly harming the microorganisms that thrive in healthy soils, and that ultimately undermine soil health and ultimately undermine productivity on the farm. So to this fifth point, so this fifth argument is that GMOs reduce chemical use. So since the advent of agricultural chemicals post World War II, there's been a huge learning curve in the scientific community about the impact of agricultural chemicals on human health, on ecosystem health, and on the health of the farmers and pesticide applicators. And we've really had, I think, a real healthy debate in this country about agricultural chemicals, and increasingly public health advocates and many others have raised alarm about the use of agricultural chemicals in this country. The President's Panel on Cancer from several years ago pointed out that there's 1,400 chemicals that are being used largely on agriculture in this country, and many of them have been untested, that they really pose huge concerns for human health. So this argument that, hey, do GMOs reduce the use of chemicals is an argument being made in that context. And what we know now from the evidence on the ground is that the use of GMOs has actually increased the amount of chemicals that farmers are using. It hasn't decreased it. Charles Benbrook has been perhaps the best source of the research on this question. He's been looking at the use of chemicals in agriculture, and that the overall increase of chemicals in agriculture in the U.S. has actually gone up, and that GMOs have been a huge part of that. And of course, one of the biggest concerns, certainly, that I increasingly have is the spiked use of agricultural use of glyphosate. That was an herbicide that I mentioned. The herbicide that I mentioned, the World Health Organization said that is a probable carcinogen. And I think that when you look at the next slide, you'll see just how much that use of glyphosate has increased. So this is a slide from the Center for Food Safety that mapped mapped the growth of the use of glyphosate. You can see in which crops: corn, soybean, and others. And when Roundup Ready, which is again that Monsanto product that's resistant to glyphosate, when those were introduced, Roundup Ready crops, and Roundup Ready is the proprietary version of glyphosate. And you can see this huge increase in the use of glyphosate, which, again, in light of the current findings from the WHO, is hugely concerning. In light of the the weed resistance that we're seeing, it's hugely concerning. The FDA, you might have seen a recent announcement that the FDA is going to start actually testing for glyphosate residue in our foods. This question of glyphosate, the impact of glyphosate on our health, on the health of a farm, this is, I think, one of the biggest questions and concerns that I have about GMOs today. The other thing that we're seeing is in places that have been kind of testing areas for GMOs, we're seeing a number of concerns being raised. So this is quite a lengthy quote from my colleague Stacey Malkin from the U.S. Right to Know Network, from a piece that she just published in The Ecologist, where she's talking about the introduction and the testing of GMOs in Hawaii. So she wrote, "Instead of bustling with promising new types of resilient, adaptive GMO crops, Hawaii is bustling with grassroots efforts to protect communities from pesticide drift, require chemical companies to disclose the pesticides they're using, and restrict GMO crop growing in areas near schools and nursing homes. Schools near farms in Kauai have been evacuated due to pesticide drift, and doctors in Hawaii say they are observing increases in birth defects and other illnesses they suspect may be related to pesticides." So I recommend this piece if you want to kind of read more about what's happening in Hawaii. But there's a lot of places where people are raising these concerns about the use of chemicals in GMO technology and the increase of chemicals as a result of the introduction of GMOs. One thing that I would say before jumping to this final argument is that that you'll often hear from industry about there's an initial drop in the use of certain insecticides as a result of GMO technology. But I would just stress that overall there's an increase. And so keep your kind of spidey sense open when you hear about a claim that, well, this insecticide decreased under this new regime of GMOs. Yes, certain products, there's been a decrease, but what's important to look at, I would argue, is what's the overall story? Are we overall now, as a result of GMOs, using more chemicals in agriculture? And the answer is yes. What you're also seeing in this kind of new generation of GMOs that are being proposed in the marketplace today is the proposal to have new GMOs that are resistant to even more toxic agricultural chemicals, something that I think should be a concern for all of us. So the final argument is this argument that there is no alternative, that organic agriculture, might be inefficient, we can't scale it, that GMOs are kind of the only way to go. And one of the things that's been very encouraging to me over the past 10 years is just this growing body of science, growing body of evidence about the benefits of organic agriculture, that we're seeing real documented results, that organic farming practices are reducing erosion, conserving water, of course, reducing chemical applications. When it comes to climate change, I'm particularly excited about the studies that I've read about how much less energy is used on organic farms, how much less greenhouse gas emissions are associated with organic food production, things that are really promising and really exciting. And I know that I really rely on Food Tank as a great resource for examples of organic farming success stories. I know that Food Tank President Danielle Nierenberg did incredible research across the continent of Africa for 2 years, documenting this widespread evidence about how communities benefit when organic agricultural principles are embraced. And one of the types of organic agriculture, it's also referred to as agroecology, which is, again, these principles of using the resources of a farm to produce soil fertility versus using a synthetic fertilizer, to use the ecology of a farm to deal with pests, to use people to deal with weeds, to use creative, innovative, highly technological techniques to address the kinds of concerns that chemical agriculture addresses with toxic chemicals. And what's really encouraging is that this form of agroecology is really taking off worldwide. And one of the really fun aspects of my work is advising donors who are supporting projects around the world. And one of the funds that I advise is called the Agroecology Fund. And every year we are overwhelmed with proposals from groups around the world that are really proving agroecology works on the ground. I love this one example from the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh that saw the increasing toll of toxic pesticides that were being used in that region on farmland, acute poisonings, long-term health impacts, increasing forms of certain cancer, neurological and hormonal problems. So they were seeing all of these toxic chemicals having this real impact in their community. And the state of Andhra Pradesh started looking into other alternatives, and agroecology they saw as this really powerful alternative. In 2004, the state started a pilot study with 300,000 farmers in what they called non-pesticide management on farmland. And so with that pilot study, which I would not argue is small, 300,000 farmers is quite extensive. They taught farmers these agroecological techniques, alternatives to toxic pesticides to deal with the pest problems that were plaguing the farmers. So for instance, they would do things like they taught farmers how to deal with the pod borer, which is a pest that attacks key crops that they were growing, like lentils and okra and others. And they taught farmers how to use and work with nature instead of chemicals. So to combat the pest, they taught farmers how to use natural controls like manually removing infected leaves or spraying the leaves with an extract of neem seed or using a naturally occurring virus that attacks the pod borer. All of that was an alternative to what they had been using, which were insecticides that were highly toxic. So what was the result in this one specific example was the farmers saw that the pod borer stayed away, that the yields stayed steady and increased, and farmers were paying much less for chemicals. Therefore, they were earning higher incomes, and of course, they were experiencing less of the negative impacts of the use of toxic chemicals. And so that's just one tiny example, and what happened in that state is the program expanded now to an estimated 1 million farmers across 1 million hectares in the state of Andhra Pradesh. And I tell that story because I feel like it's so important to hear these not small scale stories of the implementation of these agroecological principles that really address what farmers need, especially in the developing world. So one of the things that I think is so powerful about this story is that those farmers are using the seeds for those crops I mentioned. So lentils, okra, some of the other crops are growing in the region, or sorghum and peas. They're using seeds that they are sharing and saving. They are using techniques that they are learning and that are in some cases free, in some cases very affordable, versus the model of a system like GMOs that would require farmers to buy seeds year after year and therefore be vulnerable to the fluctuation of seed prices and what are called the technology fees that are embedded in that seed price for GMO seeds. So they'd have to pay for those seeds. They'd have to pay for synthetic fertilizer. They'd have to pay for those chemicals, all of which is a huge burden on cash poor farmers, and also hugely makes them vulnerable to fluctuations in the marketplace, makes them vulnerable to spikes in prices, makes them vulnerable to decisions of chemical companies literally half a world away. So those stories are the kinds of stories I think are really important to highlight and to share. And I find when I tell stories like this that a lot of people have never heard about them or surprised about them, and part of the reason is that the groups that are promoting these efforts that are educating farmers around the world are really under-resourced. I spoke in Turkey with one of these groups called the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements. I spoke at their international summit, and it's a network of organic farmers around the world. And I was struck. I was looking at the budget for this international network. Their annual budget that in 2013 was just 0.01%, 0.01% of Monsanto's total sales. So you're talking about like this tiny, tiny fraction, just this one network's tiny fraction of resources to try to educate farmers, organize farmers, help advocate for the policies at the state level and the federal levels that would help to incentivize this kind of production. So there's a massive imbalance in resources. If you look at the research dollars for agriculture, public or private, a tiny fraction, less than about 1%, goes to developing and improving organic and agroecological methods. So you're talking about an imbalance in research dollars as well. So we often hear that we can't feed the world with organic agriculture because it's too hard to bring to scale, it's not proven to produce the yields that we need. But I think it's really clear in looking at this imbalance of investment that there's just never been sufficient resources invested in the developing the training that we need and developing the innovations that are there for the taking in organic farming. And that I would argue that despite that imbalance, what's so incredible is the extent of success stories of organic agriculture around the world, despite how under-resourced it is. I feel like if we really are committed to addressing the root causes of hunger, to feeding the future, that we really need to draw on the evidence that we have at hand and to demand that our governments and international institutions invest in organic farming and research. I want to close with this quote from the FAO Director General, who said, when he's talking about kind of what we see, what we need to invest in. So what we're seeing is a model of production, and this is a sort of conventional chemical model of production that can't prevent degradation of soils and loss of biodiversity, that are both essential goods, especially for future generations. We need a paradigm shift. Food systems need to be more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. So with those words, I will close, and I will thank you again for joining me for this call. I will take questions now, and I urge you all to connect with us. You can find our work at realfoodmedia.org. You can find me on Twitter at Anna Lappe. We also have another website, foodmyths.org, that has a short video that in about 8 minutes, I think, it gets into a lot of the debate that you've heard me talk about today, and that you are free to watch online, of course, but also share at events or in classrooms and share with others. So I will take a few questions now before we get off the call.
Great, thank you, Anna, and thanks for an informative presentation with lots of great examples. We had a lot of interaction from kind of both sides of the argument throughout your presentation, and we do have a lot of questions from listeners. So just as a reminder, if people want to continue to send those in, you can send them to sarah@foodtank.com or in your chat box. So I'd like to start by asking you, Anna, the first question comes from Mark. He asks, are there any examples of ecological farms that are operating on a larger or growing level that you can share with us for those of us who are interested in transitioning?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned that example from Andhra Pradesh, but that's far, far away. What I'm really encouraged by are some of the stories that I'm hearing from our Midwest about farmers shifting their mode of production. And these are commodity farmers, not like all of a sudden becoming a boutique shop that's growing kale for hipsters and fancy restaurants, but shifting their model of production by integrating agroecological principles and seeing powerful results. So let me tell you what I mean by that, and I'll tell you about a group that you can connect with to learn more. So what I mean by that is commodity growers that are transitioning off of GMOs, that are going back to conventional. And not necessarily going full bore organic, but doing things like adding one or two more crop rotations into their production systems. And so by doing so, it's building up their soil health, it's increasing the fertility of their soils, and they're seeing incredible yield results. Again, this is about kind of bringing in that principle, that agroecological principle of biodiversity, of crop rotation, of kind of thinking about how to actually build up your soils, and that it might mean that you're not producing as much corn year to year, but that over time you're actually seeing greater productivity and you're seeing less of a reliance on chemical inputs. One of the groups that I would really recommend if you want to see some great examples is the Practical Farmers of Iowa. And the Leopold Center is also another resource that I would recommend. So the Practical Farmers of Iowa and the Leopold Center are two groups if you want to look at what's happening in the U.S. around this. And I would also say that there are one final example of really organic agriculture taken to scale again in this country. So there are tons of examples around the world, but I think it's helpful to look at the U.S. is the success of the organic farming cooperative called Organic Valley, which is producing at a huge scale. They just hit the $1 billion sales mark. And what's so wonderful about them is I see them as a huge as functioning on a huge scale, but still respecting and operating from this principle of a mission to protect family farmers. So the idea is by working as a co-op, their farmers are able to pool their milk, for instance, for the dairy farmers in their co-op, to pool their milk together to sell into the national market and to sell regionally. And they're able to be much stronger as a co-op than a small-scale organic dairy operator trying to sell direct to market or working on its own. So Organic Valley, I think, is another incredible success story, and it's a co-op that started in the mid-1980s with a couple renegade dairy farmers in Wisconsin who had this idea that they wanted to take power back. They wanted to bring that democracy back into the food system by building up power as farmers, and has really grown into an incredible success story and bringing organic to scale.
That's a great example, Anna. Organic Valley is one of Food Tank's sponsors for our Food Tank Summit in 2016. The next question. So there's an interesting conversation and debate going on in our chat box right now, which I'll bring to the surface, which started with Brian's question, and I'm hoping that maybe you can clarify to our audience. So he originally asked, why the push to label GMOs in food if, by our definition, GMOs are not really used in human food except for where it may be part of the livestock feed? So could you help clarify that?
Yeah, no, by not used in human food, I meant the human food like broccoli, like oranges, like apples, like food that like whole foods. And so I'm glad you raised that because I hope that wasn't I didn't mean to confuse the issue, because actually most genetically engineered crops, yes, are going into the food supply, just not, what I meant was a distinction between whole foods and commodity crops like corn and soy. So a huge portion of that corn and soy is going into livestock feed. But then a huge portion of the corn and soy is going into processed foods, and so so that's really important. So when you hear people talk about, you know, this huge percentages estimate of how much products in the supermarkets have GMOs in them, have been used with genetically engineered ingredients, it's I've seen 80%, 85%, 90%, but that's processed foods. I think it's really important. A lot of people I talk to think that they hear that GMOs are really prominent, and then they say, well, how do I know if my orange is genetically modified or if my zucchini is genetically modified? And I always say, look, you know, most whole food that you're eating is not genetically engineered. It's the processed foods that are genetically engineered. But you do bring up an important point about that a lot of genetically engineered crops are going into livestock feed, and most of the current labeling initiatives would just be labeling processed food. They wouldn't be labeling, say, meat that was raised with genetically engineered ingredients, which brings me to a point that I'm really glad that this question got me to raise, which is this point about, well, how do you know currently, without required mandatory labeling, how do you know when you're eating foods that have been raised with genetically engineered crops or not? And there's two ways to know really clearly. Number one is to look for the USDA certified seal. So that's that circle with the USDA organic on it. So USDA certified organic, because by definition, USDA certified, it does requires that no genetically engineered products were used. So that's one way. And the second way is to avoid processed foods. So obviously in the modern world and in our lives, that's really hard to do. And most of us can't do that. But, but certainly trying to have a diet as full of whole foods as possible is another way to really avoid consuming genetically engineered foods that have been raised with genetically engineered crops.
I'm really glad you used that example, Anna, and brought that up, because that actually answered another question from one of our listeners as well. So thank you. We are running short on time, but I just want to finish up with one additional question from Jill. And she writes, in your opinion, how will agricultural policy and the GMO debate present itself in the current presidential election?
Such a great question. Thank you for asking it. I don't know how many of you saw this really great infographic from the New York Times from a week or so ago that did this word mapping of which party candidates in which debates mentioned keywords most frequently. And it was words like immigration and abortion and foreign policy. And it was dozens of words. And it was showing, you know, which party talks more about those topics. And I was so struck in looking at this infographic that none of the candidates currently are talking about food. And, you know, when I believe food is kind of one of the most fundamental aspects of our lives, it's really striking to me that the candidates aren't talking about food and what their policies would be. And it's really concerning, because remember, food, of course, doesn't just intersect in our lives in the ways that you've heard me talk about today, in terms of food policy and the environment, and food policy and farmers, and our farmers better off or worse off. And, you know, food is fundamental to healthcare. Food is fundamental to the immigration conversation. Food connects to so many of the other issues that candidates are talking about. So, so how will this play out? I mean, I think that more of us that are speaking out and saying that it is outrageous that presidential candidates of either party could go through an entire primary season and not be talking about food, that's outrageous, and that they should. And if you want to kind of speak up on this, colleagues of mine have started an initiative called the Plate of the Union. And you can go sign on, calling on candidates to talk about food. And And so, I think that it's really, it sort of requires us, if we care about food, not just to kind of express those aspirations and express our beliefs in the marketplace with the food companies we support, but it also requires us to speak up to our elected officials about the kinds of policies that we want to see, the policies that would make the more sustainable way of farming easier for farmers to learn about, easier for farmers to adopt, and would allow farmers to thrive in the marketplace who are making choices that are best for the planet and best for our bodies.
Great. And with that, we run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for joining us today, Anna, and it was a pleasure to have you as always. And thank you to all of our listeners for sending in their questions. I have one quick announcement, which is that Food Tank will be hosting our second annual summit in Washington, D.C. this April, so next month, April 20th and 21st. And if conversations like these are interesting to you and you want to hear more, we're going to have 5 panels each day and lots of wonderful speakers. Over 70 are currently confirmed. You can sign up today on foodtank.com. So thank you all again, especially to you, Anna, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you so much.